Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to actually get out the bio so I can introduce us properly.
It's pronounced Fingeroth.
Excuse me?
It's pronounced Sikoryak.
Yes, thank you. I'm R. Sikoryak, otherwise known as Bob. I'm a cartoonist, and I've done a number of graphic novels with the company Drawn and Quarterly, and have been reading comics forever. And I'll be in conversation with the main event, who is a longtime editor, was a longtime editor and writer for Marvel Comics, best known for his stint as editor of the company's Spider-Man line of titles, Spider-Man. He's also taught comics writing and appreciation at New York University, the New School, and many other places. He's the author of Superman on the Couch, Disguised as Clark Kent, The Rough Guide to Graphic Novels, and A Marvelous Life. Please welcome Danny Fingeroth.
So there should be an easy to work switch on this. Oh, it's on. It's on. It's on. Oh, it's really. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, R. Sikoryak. If you have not checked out Bob's work, you should. He does incredible mashups of classic literature and classic comic characters. So say you've done Brothers Karamazov as a Batman story?
Crime and Punishment.
Crime and Punishment,
as
sorry.
a Batman story.
Crime as a Batman story.
And things of that nature.
And and all sorts of really interesting uses of comics and other media. They're the very definition of mashup. And you did the graphic interpretation of the
iTunes Terms and Conditions. The unedited text as a graphic novel.
That's right.
So, but we really shouldn't be talking about it so much.
Anyway, I wrote this book about Stan Lee. Thank you to the Cinema Arts Center. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I've been to Long Island before. Some of my best friends live on Long Island. So thank you so much for coming out. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and then we're going to go through some slides, images from Stan's life and career, and Bob and I will talk. We'll do some Q&A, and we'll have fun. This is from Chapter 9, called Creating Characters. Now, maybe Varda, what do you think? Hold the mic, or?
In the stand.
In the stand, okay. It's my producer. Okay. Chapter 9, Creating Characters. Marvel's achievement in the 1960s wasn't to publish one great story, or even many great stories. It was to create a phenomenon that for many lived up to the hype surrounding it. Like few popular culture touchstones, the Beatles come to mind, Marvel kept on living up to its hype for far longer than most explosions of pop culture. Stan Lee, in the first era of Marvel's 1960s success, was able, after helping create it, to recognize, exploit, and maintain for a full decade the phenomenon's first incarnation, and to plant the seeds for it to regularly renew itself, as you may have noticed. So then, whoever really invented the specific first wave of Marvel characters, however the stories were developed, there was one consistent, singular, call it omniscient voice, telling you the stories, and as importantly, welcoming you into the world of Marvel. That voice had a name in the real world and in the magazine's pages. That name was Stan Lee. It was the voice that told you, starting with the third issue, that Fantastic Four was the world's greatest comic magazine. It was the voice that introduced issue 15 of Amazing Spider-Man by saying on the first page, lettered inside a giant arrow pointing at Spider-Man, for any of you who've been living in another galaxy for the past 2 years, we'll explain that this is Spider-Man. And this is certainly the most exciting Spidey adventure we've ever presented since the last one. It's got villains, heroes, action, a mishmash of everything, and it's told in the Marvel manner, enough said. It's the voice that in the same issue listed the credits thus: written by Stan Lee, because we couldn't afford Mickey Spillane. Illustrated by Steve Ditko, because Picasso was out of town. Lettered by Art Simic, because his name fits the space. It's the voice that on the cover of issue 16, where Spider-Man first meets Daredevil, advised, "Warning, if you don't say this is one of the greatest issues you've ever read, we may never talk to you again." This omniscient, fourth wall breaking, friendly, self-deprecating voice was the voice of Marvel. It was written as the editorial we, and portrayed as the collective voice of Stan and Jack Kirby, or Stan and Steve Ditko, or the voice of the entire Marvel bullpen. It was, of course, though, the voice of Stan Lee. Whoever it was, in letters page responses and special announcements, he could say things like this from Spider-Man 20. "One thing we get a kick out of is the occasional fan who writes in to demand that we give Sonny Steve some more strips to draw. Poor old darling Ditko does about 20 pages of Spidey each month, plus 10 pages of Doctor Strange, plus 10 pages of the Hulk, and he still finds time to argue with Stan for a few hours each week." Was this a witty remark, an accurate description of Lee and Ditko's relationship? Both. The voice could also say things like this from Spider-Man 21. "We haven't seen the sketches for Spider-Man 22 yet, but Stan and Steve have been walking around chuckling to themselves and patting each other on the back for days, so they must have something pretty special cooked up. Anyway, when these two characters go to town, how bad can it be?" This was a remarkably clever way to say that they, by this point most likely just Ditko, hadn't plotted the issue yet. It created the illusion that someone other than Stan was reporting on these wonderful guys, Stan and Steve. And then Stan and Steve were such great pals who so enjoyed their collaborations that they walked around patting each other on the back for days. And by golly, it did make you want to come back next issue to see what they'd come up with. Or take this special announcement for the letters page of Fantastic Four 23. We needed a name for the villain of X-Men 3. And Stan and Jack were kicking a few around when a boy delivering sandwiches walked in and jokingly said, "He looks like a big blob. Call him the Blob." Stan and Jack looked at each other and said, "Why not?" In one paragraph, Lee switches from being the teller of the anecdote to being one of the people being told about, to doing an apparent mind meld with Kirby where the combined Stan Jack is willing to take advice from a regular working stiff, a boy delivering sandwiches no less. Did this story really happen? Did a delivery boy get to name a villain? Were Stan and Jack actually there to agree that was the perfect name? And of course, where's the moment where editor Stan or publisher Martin Goodman had to approve a decision made by the writer and artist? This is the same voice that can also get plenty serious, as in the letters column to Fantastic Four 24, when it declares, after a water break, "Many readers say they don't like referring to our mags as comic mags. We must disagree. It is our intention here at Marvel to produce comics which are so well written and well drawn that they'll elevate this entire field in the mind of the public. After all, comic magazines are an art form, as creative and enjoyable as any other." Stating this thought this way was a major step. In an era before widespread consideration of comic books as art, and less than a decade after Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, no one inside comics, and few outside of it, thought of it as anything beyond craft, and fairly low-level craft at that. Only Will Eisner had spoken on the record of comics as art, and that was back in 1941. Lee's bold statement was followed lower down on the same letters page, while signing off for the issue with this. "And so till next issue, remember, we're working night and day to bring you the best in story and art, to make you proud of the comic magazines you read." Imagine this voice and this intimate medium making you laugh, giving you insider stories, ballyhooing the very issue you're reading, promoting the upcoming issue, adding narratively unnecessary but fun as hell verbiage and wordplay, extending your time reading the comic, so also adding to its value as entertainment time purchased, and complimenting you on how great you are for simply reading it, and of course enjoying, not to mention buying the comic. This was unprecedented. Your parents, your older siblings, your non-comic loving friends, they may all make fun of or simply just not understand the hold these gaudy pamphlets have on you. But the voice of Marvel does. the entity that is Marvel does. Stan Lee does. Stan Lee had become the literal and figurative voice of Marvel. And now we'll move on to part from chapter 11, entitled Boom, Boom, Boom. Baby boomer navel-gazing is beyond a cliche, and yet there seems to be no better way to explain Marvel's popularity and Stan Lee's early 60s celebrity than as a factor of boomer culture. A significant number of kids who were hooked by Marvel from early Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and the rest grew from childhood to adolescence, or from adolescence to adulthood during the period from 1961 to the late 60s, and maintained an interest in Marvel's characters and creators over those years. Of course, most adolescents dropped comics, but a fair number now did stay with them, including college students. And as Kirby was bursting boundaries of concepts and vision, Lee was doing the same with writing, editing, and promotion. Certainly the fact that both men had boomer children could well have been a factor in what they were thinking and storytelling about. They had literal skin in the game. The world in which their children were growing up was knocking constantly at their doors. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll wasn't just a glib slogan to them. They were realities that their kids faced daily at school and on the streets, and for that matter, on TV and in the movies. It was what everybody's kids faced. There were 70 million boomers in a country of 200 million. So the audience that had been in grade school in the early and mid-60s was now heading for college, or Vietnam, or the Peace Corps, or Canada, or Haight-Ashbury, or a factory, or an office. And many members of that audience kept up with Marvel's comics. And many of them wanted to know what Stan Lee thought about what was going on in the world. Why? Largely because Lee had happened upon a personal connection with Marvel's readers, and Lee was synonymous with Marvel. Stan Lee, an actual person with a vulnerable public persona, was the voice and face of Marvel in a time when corporate mascots, Superman and Batman, were the voice and face of DC. And no one was really the voice and face of any other comics company. So it didn't really matter to most readers what DC editors Julius Schwartz or Bob Kanigher or Mort Weisinger thought about the issues of the day. These men, whatever their real-life personalities, didn't think of themselves as publicists or cheerleaders or spokespersons. Their job was to put out entertaining comic books that sold well enough for them to keep on putting out entertaining comic books that sold well enough. Stan Lee had decided that his job description was something else. A child of the Great Depressions and of the peregrinations of the comics business, he seemed to instinctively realize that his desperation move to provide Marvel with a friendly face also gave him a launching pad for becoming a celebrity who, surprisingly, probably even to himself, had opinions and feelings and passions that related both directly and tangentially to a medium and a company that he thought he had long ago ceased caring about. Lee took to this new celebrity like the proverbial duck to water. He developed a new look that involved fashionable suits, a neatly trimmed beard, and a stylish, well-sculpted toupee. It had become clear that so long as Marvel was prominent, he would be prominent. And if Marvel ever lost its cachet, or if it decided it didn't need Stan Lee anymore, he was now in a position to take his celebrity and do with it whatever he felt necessary and appropriate. Sure, he was in the comics business, but he was now also in the larger entertainment business. Most importantly, he was in the Stan Lee business. And that, it would turn out, would be a very interesting business. It was a business that would be the key to pretty much everything professionally and often personally that would happen to him for the rest of his life. If there was ever someone in the right place, at the right time, with the right skill set, experience, and personality to make the most of the possibilities presented to him and created by him, it was Stan Lee. Thank you. Well, now, thank you. Thank you for putting up with that. Hey, Bob. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I hear you wrote a book.
I did.
Ooh, I need to make sure this thing is on.
Oh, it was, let's see.
There we go. Okay,
Okay,
great.
see.
So, there's so much to talk about when it comes to Stan Lee. I am very grateful that Danny put this slideshow together, because I think what we'll do is we'll go through this fairly chronological look at Stan's life, and we'll sort of talk about the various elements as we go. But we're only scratching the surface here. You should really read the book. It's very good.
Well, I think they got a copy with their tickets.
All right, so we're just gonna pop through this. And,
Okay.
Maybe I'm doing it backwards. There we go. So
Don't mind me.
you start with Stan introducing one of the comics. So this was, I'm assuming this was in the front cover of one of the books. I can't remember now. I know I've seen this as a
was the
kid.
inside cover. Well, the bonus question is what comic? I know. The bonus question is what comic is he holding in his hand? This was for my generation, and for a lot of people, the first view we ever had of Stan Lee. This was our impression of who he was and what he looked like. The middle-aged guy, but youthful and kind of exuberant. But the Frank Sinatra hat was the big thing. We didn't know then it was because he hadn't yet discovered toupees. But that is really the image burned into the mind. That's from the inside cover of Fantasy Masterpieces #1, which, and Stan is there introducing their reprints of stories done by his main collaborators, Kirby, Ditko, Ayers, Sinnott, Don Heck. And really, I think for any 50s born early Marvel fan, that was Stan Lee, and it was a great image to have.
So what year is this?
This is like 66, 67, I'd say.
So this is 5 or 6 years after he starts co-producing the superhero comics that have created this empire.
Right, and there had been the occasional photo. Marvel used to print photos of their various artists and writers, and they were not very good photos and reproduced really poorly in the comics, so that you really didn't know what they looked like. Somehow this, and then there's of course a really big blow up of that image. I do think that one photo, and it's never been credited. I have no idea who even took it. Marvel was part of a larger magazine publishing operation. They always had photographers around, so it might have been Vinnie Coletta, who was also an inker for Marvel, but I've never seen a credit. But that picture, I just think, gave us all this subliminal feeling of who the person speaking to us on the covers, in the letters pages, in the bullpen bulletins, in the funny captions that would reference you to whatever previous issue. It was all a package. And while Stan obviously had the ego and the ambition to do it, he also had nobody else there to do it. There was no promotions department, there was no publicity department, no marketing department, there was barely an editorial department. And so he did all that.
Right, and I guess we should just say, and then maybe it's coming up next. Perfect. So Stan was hired by Martin Goodman.
Martin Goodman.
When was that?
Stan was technically hired by Joe Simon, who was the editor. Comics had been around for a while, certainly since the 30s. Superman came about in 38 and really jump-started and made comics huge. And throw that woman out. You've been drinking too much, I can see that. Superman had kicked off this superhero fad, so Goodman and Timely wanted to get cash in on it, and he had a comic called Marvel Comics that had Submariner, the Human Torch, and then Joe Simon and Jack Kirby came along, and they were his editor and art director, and they created Captain America together. Stan was Martin's wife's cousin, and Martin was also married to Stan's uncle. Martin was married to Stan's aunt. Okay, no, forget it. Uncle Robbie it's very complicated. Stan was doubly, at least, related. And he had graduated high school about a year before, had a number of short-term jobs, none of which lasted. He had one he found very depressing, writing obituaries for people who hadn't yet died, which is how you have to do it, actually, for famous people. And so he came, he was kind of forced on Simon and Kirby as an assistant, with no reason to think this job would last any more than 3 months. But then, so that was
1940.
Late 1940. So he graduated high school in '39, DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and then ended up here. And then Simon and Kirby quit in a dispute over money, oddly enough, with Goodman, which is a recurring theme in Stan's history and in comic book history. And Stan, at 18, was made the acting editor-in-chief till Goodman could find, as Stan would say, a real adult. And he, obviously has not yet found that real adult. So Stan became the editor, and then, except for his 3 years in the Army during World War II, he held that job for the next 30 years.
Oh, this is when he was in the Army?
In the Army, working on promotion, publicity, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, educational material. He wrote a marching song for the accountants in his division to build morale. But he also came up with clever ways for them to teach people skills, including accounting. He's there, I think, drawing a character called Private Snafu that I think he kind of ripped off from another character named Snafu that was around. And his most famous campaign was the VD, not me, ad campaign, which was sort of self-explanatory. But that was so he served in the Army, but he stayed in the States. He was in New York, Indiana, I think maybe Virginia, a few other states. So this is Stan around the age when he would have been hired to first work at Marvel, or Timely as it was called. And this is Captain America, #1, the famous cat punching Hitler in the face. But my favorite thing about that cover is, look, they've taken it off, and some of the versions of it, I think that you can see a little type above there. It labels the television as a television, so that in 1941 you would know what that weird thing was in the background. So Stan came on assisting them, sweeping floors, erasing stray pencil marks.
And they had created Captain America before he was working there?
Yes, they
by a few months.
Yeah, when he came in, I believe, was the same week that Captain America 1 came out. So it was pretty early on. They needed an assistant because they were editor and art director, but also doing a lot of freelance work. And as I say, Goodman, a lot of the stuff was still being packaged by an outside company. But Goodman was starting to realize that maybe comics were here to stay. It wasn't just a brief fad, so he started staffing up. And so if you go to the next one, this is from Captain America #3. It's Stan's first published work, at least professionally published work. He was born and went by the name Stanley Martin Lieber, and the comics needed 2 pages of text material so they could get lower rates for shipping and postage for subscriptions, and I think just for shipping to newsstands. And really, anybody who could hold a pencil or a pen would be given the job to write these things. And so, and Stan took the name Stan Lee because he always said he was saving Stanley Lieber for the great novels that he would later write that he never did. Because Stan Lee is a ridiculous name. Anytime, even now, I say, I've written a book about Stan Lee. Stan Lee who? No, Stan Lee. Stan Lee who? Or they think he's Asian. So it's a name you take when you're 17 years old and you don't want to use your real name, and you go, oh. And a lot of people in comics changed their names either because they didn't want people to know they were Jewish or Italian, or they didn't want their families to know what they were doing.
So many, just to go back to,
yeah.
for a second, so many decisions by cartoonists made at the age of 17 go on to haunt them forever, such as becoming a cartoonist. So I can relate, and I feel like a lot of what Stan's career is about is being in this position, I'm assuming getting very excited about the possibilities of his job and maybe getting into the wider world of entertainment,
Right.
but it took him a long time to get there.
It did, and I think he really did think he was going to be a novelist or a screenwriter or an actor. He had all those ambitions, and this, I never have read why he picked the name Stanley, except it was his first name broken into two. But it's it couldn't have taken long for him to realize. I just think, the other people in comics were Bob Kane and, Jack Kirby, but everybody had like the most 3 syllables to their name. So Stan Lee was just efficient. So what do we have next? Oh, I'll actually go back to 1 second. This is notable also because Jack Kirby drew that illustration. So this is the first Lee and Kirby collaboration. And then Stan would go on to co-create with a variety of artists, characters, including the Destroyer from Mystic Comics. He co-created a character named Jack Frost. Just a lot. That was the job. There was one called Headline Hunter, which was as you may imagine, he was a reporter who traveled all over the world. But he wasn't the only 17-year-old. The weird thing about comics in those days was that there were a lot of 17 and 18 and 15 and 16-year-olds who were out earning their fathers. That's the surreal thing. They weren't, yes, they loved what they were doing, but it was the Depression, or just coming out of the Depression, and Stan's family in particular needed him to make a living. His father was chronically under or unemployed. So that's the odd, the odd thing is that you read the histories of it, you talk to a lot of the people who were there at or near the beginning, and they are making more money than their fathers at age 17. It must have been an unreal kind of experience for them too. So and speaking, this was a Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal were co-created by Stan Lee and Al Jaffe.
Still living and still drawing.
Still drawing, still living. And this was, again, Goodman's company and all the comic companies. They worked in a dozen different genres. And now you can see these look like animated cartoons because they're, it's kind of a Porky Pig-like character. I don't know if anybody else had a seal. That was pretty novel, the Silly Seal. So this was among the dozens of characters that Stan and artists he worked with. And Al worked for Timely for 10 years as a writer, an editor, an artist, and he and Stan were very close at times, and that. And Al has great stories, some of which are in the book, some of which are in Al's memoir. But this, so Stan didn't just do superheroes, and for many years didn't do any superheroes. He loved doing humor, he loved doing satire, he loved doing romance. But Marvel recently did a new Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal comic, which took me a long time to get a copy for Al. It was like, Al, they must have sent you a copy. No, I'll throw my weight around. And sure enough, within the next 6 months, Al had that copy of Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal. So what do we got next? That's Stan in the 50s. No, keep watching the hairline.
Also, so you can see that the popular genres of the style would always change.
Right.
And they would often follow the trends. I don't think it's unfair to say that Stan Lee was often like chasing whatever was popular at the time.
Right, and so what was popular was some superhero stuff. Crazy, which was kind of their Mad magazine, Crazy, Wild, Unknown Worlds, Mystic, and as you'll see later, they did romance.
Science fiction.
But the thing about Marvel, of course, or Atlas or Timely, as it interchangeably called, the myth is, right, that it was the little engine that could. It was this tiny company, and they came up with Fantastic Four, and then Spider-Man and grew to this empire. They were huge. They were the biggest or the second biggest producer by volume in the 40s and 50s. Stan and a staff of editors and of artists, where there was a rivalry. There were two rooms. There was the adventure comic room with the superhero stuff, and there was the funny animal and humor room. And they were kind of two separate bullpens, and each had contempt for the other. Those guys couldn't draw anything funny. Well, those guys couldn't draw a realistic superhero. And it was, but that was when there was a real Marvel bullpen. And Stan, in the late 50s, shortly after this photo, there was a big implosion in the industry in general and in Marvel in particular. And then it did become Stan, as he used to describe himself, as the human pilot light, where he was the only editorial staff member, probably because Martin didn't want to have to explain to the other editors why he had to fire Stan. And just sort of in a broader context, half the people who worked at Marvel were named Goodman, or at Magazine Management, the larger company. It wasn't like Stan was this big exception.
So there were a lot of artists on staff.
Right.
And then they all got fired, and some of them worked as freelancers, but Stan was the only one who stayed in the office.
Exact. Stan and maybe a secretary and maybe one correct. But Stan was famous in the early days, especially, say, if you'd come in to deliver pages for Iron Man. Stan would say, "Oh, these are great. I need some corrections on Spider-Man. Would you mind sitting here and touching up this?" He just did not have any kind of a style. I think he himself did, whenever he could, lettering and art corrections. Just because he could hold a pen, and he was a decent caricaturist. I've seen him draw caricatures. He was actually not bad. So that's sort of the 50s, and this is when horror comics were very big. Timely put out a lot of horror comics. This is one that Stan not only edited but wrote all the stories, and of course because he was the head editor. I don't think the title was editor-in-chief, but that's what he was. He could have his pick of his favorite artists, so often Russ Heath or John Romita, and some, Bill Everett. They would draw the stories he wrote, and that was, I don't know if Marvel or Atlas, it was called, ever got as over the top as the EC comics that were famously over the top in the horror era, but I think they came close. I mean, when they were having congressional hearings in the 50s to investigate the pernicious effect of comic books on children, there were a bunch of Atlas comics that were shown by the senators. That's when having real hearings in Congress about important things. We need more comic book hearings, I think. And this Groot you may recognize. In the late 50s.
He's very talkative, by the way.
He's very talkative, especially his armpits. He's got that. He's very talkative and he's very big. When movies like Godzilla and Them were popular, this was around the time that, after Simon and Kirby had left Marvel, Jack Kirby came back to the company and the people he vowed he would never work for, which was Marvel and Stan Lee and Martin Goodman. But he had burned every other bridge behind him for numerous reasons, and Stan was always happy to have him back. So they did a lot of every genre, but a lot of monster stories. That's where Fin Fang Foom and Grotu and Gugam, who was the son of Goom, as many of you may recall, came. And Groot, because of the Guardians of the Galaxy, of course, is the one that's most remembered now. And this was co-created, as were many of these stories, by Lee and Kirby, and scripted from plots given to him by Stan's brother, Larry Lieber.
Who kept his name.
Who did keep his name, yes. And ironically, he may be the one who goes on to write novels. This is Larry. This is more recent. We've jumped ahead in time. So 5, 6 years ago at a convention in New York, that's Larry. That's Stan. And that is a guy named Ken Bald, who also recently passed away in his late 90s. He was literally and figuratively Stan's oldest friend. They became friends in the early 40s. Ken went on to syndicated comics, did the Dr. Kildare strip, and then went into advertising and actually made some real money. but they remained close, and they and their wives would go on vacations together. And Larry Larry just stopped doing the Spider-Man newspaper strip. He's been actively doing comics. And the book talks about their relationship, which was complicated. But Larry, if you ever get a chance to see Larry, you should, because he doesn't make many public appearances, and he's great fun.
I wanted to point out one thing about this, actually, because you mentioned that Ken Bald drew newspaper comics, which was a much higher level of comics to be involved in.
Right.
And while Stan was doing the editing of the Marvel comic books, he was also trying to sell, and did sell, a number of syndicated newspaper comics, right?
Syndicated comics were the holy grail. We have some syndicated people here. Let's see your grail. Okay. And although many of the skill sets were the same, just I guess because newspaper comics were in newspapers, which people read every day, and every member of the family read the newspaper. It was just, and people like Al Capp and Chester Gould, they were celebrities and lived like celebrities and earned like celebrities, and that was what nobody in those days went into comics as their ultimate ambition. It was a stepping stone to something else. So Stan was constantly sending out proposals to an agent named Tony Mendez, who represented him, as well as many people we know, and Erwin Hazen, and probably more people that I'm blanking, but a million. She was the top agent. She was a former Rockette who then became a cartoon agent. So Stan had a couple of successful strips that weren't runaway big hits. One was called Mrs. Lyon's Cubs. That was about a Cub Scout troop and their wacky adventures. And it was approved by the Cub Scouts of America. And another one was, what the hell was that? The name he always used.
The Mailman?
Yeah. What was the mailman that he played in Fantastic Four movie?
Lumpy.
Willie Lumpkin. Willie Lumpkin was another one about a small town mailman. So none of these were runaway hits, but he was proud of them and did them. And he did a ton of other freelance writing. He lived through the Depression. He lived through at least 2 implosions of the comic business. And so he was always looking for ways out or ways to supplement his income. I think his ultimate goal was Hollywood, but he was in this sort of velvet trap, as you would say. He made a nice living. He could do as much freelance work as he could assign himself. Martin couldn't really fire him, And so he had a nice lifestyle, but I think he always wanted more and was always trying, so those strips were part of it. This is once Stan and Marvel started becoming popular, especially on college campuses.
So this is after the superheroes have
The superheroes arrived, but still no toupee.
In the 60s, I should say. It's not the 40s.
This is 66. So no toupee yet. But Stan is being given an award by the Princeton University Philosophic Cliosophic Society. And 2 of those guys are twins, I guess the ones that look alike. They came to the office, and I think Stan loved the idea that there could be an older audience. I think it started maybe with letters from guys like Roy Thomas and Jerry Bales, who were very early grown-up fans. There were people, Bales had a doctorate in geology, I think. Roy was a high school teacher in Missouri. And I think Stan just saw that as a larger audience that would enable him to do more interesting work, and that would give him some extra kind of credibility after 20 years of slogging away with Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal, And so that these guys, his look on his face is not so enthusiastic, but, because probably he had work to do, and Country Joe and the Fish were waiting in the waiting room to come, which they often came to the office. But I think he loved this kind of attention that he was getting for himself and for Marvel and for comics.
And as you said in the introduction, there was this real effort to keep saying, these are comics, but we're making them for a different audience. We're trying to elevate the medium.
Well, there was a comic called Amazing Adult Fantasy. Yeah, I know. It wasn't that kind of comic. that later became Amazing Fantasy, where Spider-Man debuted. But that comic's slogan was the magazine that respects your intelligence. I do think it was the attention that college-educated and even doctoral level fans were paying to him, and the DC Comics of the era too. As much as he claimed to not read DC Comics, he had to know these same guys were writing to Julie Schwartz and Bob Kanigher and were, I'm sure it was a business decision. Fewer kids are reading comics. Suburbanization meant that there were fewer candy store and drug stores. That if you wanted a comic, you had to get your mom to drive you to a store. But that's a whole different thing than stopping on your way home from school on your bike and buying a comic and a malted. So I think anything to expand that audience was of interest to him financially and because he was bored out of his mind. Okay, first toupee. And so this is a year or two later, and that's a cover of Strange Tales drawn by a guy named Jim Steranko, who many of you, I'm sure, know that name. Steranko was one of the few artists of his generation, people born in the 30s, to be hired at comics. Because comics was a closed shop and went through these periods of ups and downs, there was a long period when nobody born in the 30s was being hired. It was all the guys born in the teens and 20s, and then and later on people born in the 40s and 50s. Steranko was one of the few members of that generation to get into comics, and he did a lot of groundbreaking stuff and had, I think, a lot of arguments about what was acceptable stylistically with Stan. But yeah, so this is Stan again as Marvel's getting more famous, and the hair treatments. He always had good toupees. I mean, that's you got to hand it to him.
So what year is this?
I'd say this is 67.
Okay, so I just want to also say Fantastic Four and Spider-Man came out in...
Fantastic Four 61, Spider-Man 6. Almost all of what we think of as the classic Marvel characters came out between 61 and 63. I mean, it really a very short period. Daredevil a little later only because the artist missed the deadline. But almost everything we think of, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers, X-Men, Hulk, Iron Man, all within that Doctor Strange, 61 to 63, a really incredibly fertile period, to say the least.
And that was mostly with two artists?
Mostly with Jack Kirby, and Doctor Strange and Spider-Man with Steve Ditko. Although with both those guys, he did a ton of short mystery and horror, light horror stories, and O. Henry style surprise ending. So he had a long and deep working relationship with them before that, and a very complicated relationship that over the years, it just proves you don't have to love or get along somebody to do great work with them. Because some of the best work that he did with these guys was when they weren't talking to each other. So.
I wanted to emphasize that again because Steranko came in 6 years later, and he had maybe more freedom to experiment more. I don't know if Stan was getting more brave about what was in the books, or he was seeing...
I think Stan felt a little more secure about what was in the books, and that the company was not going to go away. And Steranko had a very powerful style. It was reminiscent of Kirby. Had a lot of influences. It had some Wally Wood, a lot of Eisner, and I think this is one of those funny things, right? You ever work at a job or something where you try forever to get something done, and your boss says, no, we can't do that. The company doesn't do anything like that. Then some new guy comes in, and they let them do that. And you go, how that, And I think that happened with this. I think Steranko was able to do stuff with design and breaking logos and even scripting his own stuff as opposed to having Stan or Larry do it. That I think just because he was like new and bold and Steranko had other options. I think this is a key thing in life, but in comics especially. If Stan said no to Steranko, he had 12 other income options. So he didn't have that desperation that some of these other artists who by temperament, could only be in comics or had burned bridges or didn't like change. So Steranko got Stan to, it's funny, you hear either of them talk about it. Steranko, and then again, if you've worked in creative fields, I think Steranko, thinks that Stan didn't let him do a lot of great stuff, and that anything that Stan let him do, he had to, take him by the collar and shake him. And Stan is like, that guy was always trying to do wild stuff. It was all I could do to restrain him, But they seem to always be fond of each other. And then here's Stan in full first flower of celebrity mode, toupee, beard.
Late 60s still?
68, I think this was. I think, again, you can always tell by what of the current comics are on the board.
Right.
The Excelsior motto comes in, which was both the New York State motto, and it was also used by a guy named Gene Shepard, who was a radio personality and a screenwriter.
He wrote A Christmas Story.
He did write A Christmas Story.
Which I think everyone knows.
And then I think he wrote a book called Excelsior, You Fatheads, I believe was his memoir. But, Stan picked it up as his own, and clearly it's become most identified with him. There were still some diehard Gene Shepard fans. And Gene Shepard was, one thing Stan did which was punching way above his weight. He would drop names like there's one letter column, I talk about it in the book, early letter column, in which a guy named Bill Cyril, who I found on Facebook because we live in 2019, in a total other context of like avant-garde film. And I said, are you the Bill Cyril who had a letter printed in Fantastic Four 3? He went, yeah, you know that letter? Bill Cyril wrote a letter that was trashed Fantastic Four, which is really critical. And you think, well, why would Stan print a letter that wasn't just a little critical? And it was because Bill Cyril mentions Gene Shepard's name in the letter. And to me, it seemed to me, just like, well, it's a critical letter, but now Marvel and Stan are associated with this hip late-night talk show host, Gene Shepard. And Stan did that all the time in this way that got you to think of Marvel as being current with pardon the expression, zeitgeist. I mean, he was really clever about stuff like that, and it didn't seem forced. It just seemed, well, of course he would talk about Gene Shepard and Alain Resnais in the same letters page that you would talk about the Hulk and
Sergeant Fury.
Groot and Sergeant Fury.
So we're up to 69 now. We have a lot more to go. I think we're going to run through these a little faster. Of course, we have to spend an hour talking about Millie.
Well, of course. This is in, for the first, it's fine. This is, we've done a series of these, and I did one with my friend David Kasakov, a Long Island native. And he pointed out to me that I often would say that my first Marvel comic was not Fantastic Four. It was when I was a real little kid, and I'd go to the barber shop, and the barber would have this moldy old box of comics, which had the comics that people didn't want, including Millie the model. And so I was reading Stan Lee comics, and drawn by Stan Goldberg and Dan DeCarlo, but I was reading Stan Lee scripted comics with the humor romance angle, without realizing it, and they were because most 6-year-olds don't have that much interest in the modeling business. I mean, it's just somehow it just is out of our attention zone. But I was at the barbershop and I'd read these and they were very clever, and some of the characters, you can keep going, So there's Stan and Stan Goldberg, who would, so it'd be that Stan Lee fourth wall breaking, where the artists and writers and editors would show up in the stories. And I think Millie here, let me see, I can do this without falling. Oh, wait, okay, now I'll be Frank Sinatra. Okay. So there's Millie refers to them as the two clever young men who write and illustrate the Millie magazines. Aren't they cute? But Clicker doesn't have to be jealous because, they're both married. Also, it looked like Stan's neck was broken in that. But anyway, And so here the characters come and they visit the two Stans in the office, where of course they did not work together. And Stan Goldberg worked at home, or actually he was in the office coloring, but as often as not working home. And Chili, she's the mean model because she's the fiery redhead. And they come in to tell them, how much, those adorable little Millie the model comic strips you create? Sure. With those lovely fashions and those funny little jokes? Yes. Well, I hate them!
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Okay. And then it's not really that big a step from that to Spider-Man post-Ditko with John Romita drawing it. And there's Mary Jane Watson, who we've been teased with not seeing what she looked like for the past 3 years. Every time she was a girl that Peter's Aunt May wanted to fix him up with, and he was sure she was, hideous looking, and there she is, of course. And very, not unlike Stan, very confident. Face a tiger, you just hit the jackpot. But of course, if you were 10 or 11 and didn't have any interest in girls, well, next, the Rhino is on the rampage. So something for everybody. And these are the great Marvel love stories. This is Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And then Steve Ditko. These are the artists with whom Stan co-created and often co-plotted, or sometimes the artists themselves plotted. And in what was called the Marvel method, which was a very improvisational way of working, which led to much conflict that, I don't know if you ever have seen social media, but sometimes people get worked up on the internet about stuff like this.
Really?
Yeah, so I've heard. But everything we think of as Marvel started with these three, and Martin Goodman too, who had more creative input than people think. This was the first official Marvel comic. Stan's assignment from Martin was, hey, the Justice League is popular over at DC. Let's put a superhero team together. Martin, we haven't put out any superhero comics for about 6 years. Don't bother me with details. So that's why the cover copy reads, featuring the Thing, Mr. Fantastic, Human Torch, Invisible Girl, together for the first time. They never existed anywhere before they were together for the first time. And you see the Thing looks like one of those monster, he could be related to Groot. So this was the very first, what we think of as modern Marvel comic, and then the next one. So I apologize for the blurriness, but it's just to give you an idea that Marvel, Fantastic Four was one of 12 comics that came out that month. They were dated November, so they came out in August probably of '61. So the FF was almost an afterthought because they were busy doing Gunsmoke Western, teenage romance, Linda Carter student nurse, amazing. They were doing anything and everything but superheroes, really. I mentioned in the book, and if you look at the same team that did Fantastic Four also did Gunsmoke Western, Lee and Kirby. In a lot of ways, the art and even the basic story in Gunsmoke Western is much easier to follow and much better than Fantastic Four 1. But obviously Fantastic Four hit some kind of nerve with the public, and the rest is history. So what else do you got? And then I just figured, since the Avengers, they've become fairly popular lately. That was the first team when they finally did come up with enough solo heroes to have a book, and then this movie, which sold a few tickets, and Spider-Man, that's where he first appeared. Although it was a story drawn by Ditko, the cover was by Kirby. It's a complicated story.
Art directing by Stan Lee.
Art directing by Stan Lee, exactly. And there was an important message to you from the editor about the new. Amazing. And then when Spider-Man, about 6 months later, got his own magazine, they had the Fantastic Four because they were the popular characters. The Fantastic Four think I'm trapped, they don't suspect my real power. This is, again, drawn by Kirby and Ditko. And that, was the next step in the Spider-Man phenomenon. By this point, they already had Thor and the Hulk and Ant-Man. So they were developing that lineup.
And they were also all meeting. which
They were all right.
happened in DC, but it was different for Marvel when the characters
Yeah.
would all hang out or run into each other on the street.
There
There was something about the way he did it that was different than
Well,
DC.
it was great cross-promotion, because if you saw the character... Right, DC, Marvel from early on, probably because one person was doing most of the writing, had and, or whatever, the same teams were doing most of everything. It gets complicated. They had one unified universe where there was one undersea Atlantis, whereas DC had at least two Atlantises, and some of them were populated by fish people and others by human. Just because the staff was so small, stuff was more consistent. But it was a great way of doing, because anytime, if Spider-Man would appear in Fantastic Four, there would be a footnote saying, by special arrangement with the publishers of Spider-Man comics, as if it wasn't the same guy sitting, at the same desk. So... And I thought it showed the first appearance of Mysterio. So Mysterio is the villain, the great Ditko design. But then Spider-Man and all the Marvels always had this other stuff. Especially, ever see a comic-made superhero take his troubles to a psychiatrist? Because what 10-year-old doesn't want to know about psychiatry? But they made it work, and I think that was part of appealing to an older, more sophisticated audience too. It didn't, every kid knew what a psychiatrist was from either their own life or from a movie or a book, or, and Stan brought it into that. Also, Goodman was a big advocate of psychiatry. Goodman's son became a well-known Jungian psychiatrist, but Goodman always advised all his employees they should go into therapy, so maybe that was a sucking up to Martin.
Is that why Stan Lee never went to therapy?
So he claims.
Oh, you think he did?
Who knows? Oh, wait, I guess a biographer should know, but I don't know. Stan claimed he never went to therapy, and I did not do any forensic. I did not go through all of Long Island and check the various therapists' offices. But if anybody here was a therapist, let me know. Okay. And that's Mysterio, because he was in the big Spider-Man movie, so I thought I should show him.
It's so interesting to think about these films because the original comics were made by a small group of people.
Tiny, yeah.
But now there are so many people trying to be faithful to this vision that ultimately has now been created by all these comic book artists over 50-some years.
Well, I think it took, it took 50-some years for a couple of generations of Hollywood executives to retire and die, for people to finally take this stuff seriously, to where it could now be derided by Martin Scorsese and Francis Coppola. That is a big step that guys like that would even notice superheroes. We can have another discussion about whether they're right or wrong, but the fact that this is even on their radar at all is a pretty miraculous thing.
Right.
And then the first black superhero was the Black Panther, although the country was still far enough not advanced that the character, it's a cool look, it's a great look, but you don't actually know he's a black person from looking at him because his face is entirely covered.
What year was that?
This is 66. And then of course, this movie did okay too. But really the stuff that we're seeing in the Marvel movies and TV shows, I guess the Panther was a relatively late character being created in 1966, but everything, way before 1970, that period where Lee and Kirby and Ditko were on fire. And you gotta credit Larry too with a lot of this stuff. So, this is a step back in time. This might be sort of more in your wheelhouse. A guy named Dennis Kitchen, who was an underground writer and artist and publisher. And in 74, financial problems both with the underground press and at Marvel led Stan and Dennis to try to do a hybrid underground mainstream comic. And they got the main underground people working for them, except for Crumb. But Spiegelman, Trina Robbins, Kim Deitch, everybody did this for the plain reason that while the big corporate monster that was Marvel was the big corporate monster, their checks cleared. And this is the cover. It was called.
And they did let them keep the
copyright.
Of course, is something that is constantly an issue with superhero artists and writers.
Well, one of the reasons that when Marvel printed, I think 2 issues or 3, and then Dennis printed the other 2. And among the reasons that it was short-lived, I mean, you can imagine, in 1974, nobody knew how to market this or who to market it to. But because the underground artists got to keep their work and their copyrights and get their artwork back before the mainstream started doing that, the mainstream artists were really pissed off. They were not pleased that these snotty young kids were getting, like Steranko, getting to do stuff. Suddenly these guys come in. So the interesting thing, Stan's credit on this series. And Dennis said, "What do you want to be called? Publisher or co-editor?" Or Stan finally said, "Call me instigator, because that way, if it's a big success, I can say, well, I instigated it. And if it's a failure, if it's a flop, he can go, well, I just instigated it." That was his rationalization. So this was like a strange period. Have you ever talked to anyone who worked on it about their experience with it?
No, not directly, no.
Yeah, well, I guess Dennis would be. Dennis has written about it, talked about it.
I believe Art Spiegelman gave work that he had already published to be republished.
Well,
I don't think he did new work for it.
Wasn't that the 2-pager that became, it was called Mouse?
But that was published earlier.
Right.
Yeah,
Funny
yes, but
Animals.
it was republished. You're right, it was republished. And so the first version of Mouse, which was a 3-page story, was printed, not originally printed, but printed in one of these.
Yeah.
I think this is also really fascinating. Obviously, I have a connection to the alternative comics world, so...
Well, Bob, you were on staff at Raw Magazine,
Yes.
Mr. Spiegelman's magazine
Yes.
in the 80s. You were the staff, I believe.
For a little while. We had other people come in. But the thing about Stan Lee doing this was constantly, I see this over and over in the book, he's constantly trying to figure out other angles, bring in new people, mention the celebrities, bring in different artists, just try to keep this thing going.
And by this point, he was publisher. Goodman had sold it, and Stan was publisher, so he could enact. I mean, he still had to get approval from the corporate powers that be, but he was the publisher. So if he, at a time of yet another big transitional time in comics, when they were willing to let him try anything, including something like this. And then I thought look at some of his cameos. This is Stan in the,
Feedback.
I'm Jimi Hendrix too. He loved doing these cameos because his ambition had always been to be an actor. And I like this one in particular from Doctor Strange, with the heroes looking particularly goofy. And Stan is some old guy laughing to himself, reading Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. Next. And then here's a couple more that you may recognize. Stan as the music teacher or music librarian, as the nearsighted, shaky-handed barber. And then, oh my God, here's a ton of them. Because, oddly enough, I don't know if any of you are here just because of the cameos, but I think there are people whose main knowledge of Stan is as that weird old guy in all the Marvel movies. And again, as you might imagine, on the internet there are many unifying theories of why this same person keeps appearing in all the Marvel movies and TV shows. And this is, a few times at Marvel, I was Stan's editor for some stories he scripted over plots by other people and artwork. This is particulars by a guy named Ron Friends. So I just because I'm as big a name dropper as Stan, I'll just say I was Stan's editor on this, and he was great to work with. He was the most professional writer I ever worked with, and
he really knew the character too.
He knew he didn't know everything that had happened to the character in the ensuing years, but it was, if I had a comment, he considered it serious. He didn't just say, I'm Stan Lee, shut up and print it. He would go like, oh, that's a good idea, I'll make that change, or that's a bad idea, let's not, but you're the editor. It was very weird. So I'm just dropping his name that I worked with him, and the next one, and even more celebrity face dropping by me. There's me and Stan doing a.
Which movie was this in?
This. This is an upcoming movie that we haven't named yet. This was for my Wizard World show.
It's Nashville.
It is Nashville. You're right. It is. It says Nashville there.
Very good eye.
Wizard World Nashville 2013. I did a lot of these panels with Stan in that period, especially, and I mean that's sort of, Stan is talking and I'm laughing. That seems. He would occasionally stop and say how wonderful I was and how terrible it was that Marvel had allowed me to quote unquote get away. I think he knew who I was, because I saw him do things like that with people who he didn't know who they were. But I think he actually, after 40 years, probably did know who I was.
Oh, there we are.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
I could ask questions all night, but what were you going to say?
Oh, well, how much time? How are we doing?
How are we doing for time?
Well, if you got some questions. It's what? Well, I don't think.
I will ask kind of a big question.
Why don't we talk a little and have some questions?
Okay, all right, if there's time. That's great. So one of the biggest questions I had about the book was there's always a sense that Stan is striving for something else, and he's kind of tied to Marvel. He's had this great success, but he's also keeps wanting to get out of it. And he talks a lot about regretting not having left the company sooner. Even before, like in the 70s, he's regretting not having left it in the 50s before he became the creator in the 60s of all these amazing characters. So do you think that plays, that psychology or those feelings play into the characters in a way?
Totally. I mean, well, the superhero in general is about loss, right? Superman losing his planet, Batman losing his parents, Spider-Man losing his Uncle Ben. It's all about loss and surviving after loss, and I think Stan, had not just the classic Depression era upbringing, born in 1922, but I think his father was, aside from the Depression being hard employment-wise for anybody, I think his father was a particularly difficult personality, because he would just go out looking for jobs and never come home. So Stan had that image of this father just like angry and depressed and out of work, and he vowed to never let that happen to him. And his mother died. He was in his 20s, but still relatively young. I think he just wanted to not have to struggle like that, and yet he had these big ambitions, but he had this secure job. And in that generation, having a secure job, doing something reasonably enjoyable with creative people, and in a family business, so probably, unless things got really bad, you couldn't get fired. I think that was at odds with that ambition, and so I think there were all these psychological things at play, and he had a very nice lifestyle. He lived on Long Island a lot of the time, in Hewlett Harbor, and before that in Woodmere. And Stan and Joan's philosophy, they told me once, was to always buy the worst place in the best area, and then fix it up. That was that was their point of view. So I just think he couldn't fully pull the trigger to leap into the unknown, because it was unknown. So I don't know. How else? I don't know if that answers your question. But,
sure.
Okay.
You also talk in the book, kind of related to that, you talk about how Stan and Ditko and Kirby each brought their own senses of loss or like longing to these characters. Because it's really the three of them that created what so many of these movies are based on, and that there is something like very deep about their personalities that come through, and somehow the three of them together were able to do that.
Yeah, it's got to do with loss and the fear of loss and the fear of losing love. I mean, just real soap opera human emotions, but filtered through the metaphor of these superheroes. But you're right, they were gifted enough to be able to take their neurotic, or whatever you want to call it, personalities. And I mean, Peter Parker's high school life was very depressing. I mean, and everything that Ditko drew had almost moss growing on it. It was very dark and very moody and very, he idolized Eisner and he idolized Jerry Robinson. And just the whole, and everything Kirby did, I think, was informed by his combat experience in World War II. They both had these very, I think, negative views of humanity, yet they were doing stories about noble superheroes. And I think Stan brought the regular guy thing to that. It's the, I don't want to get all, airy, but it's kind of the mystical, magical thing about creation and collaboration, but a lot about loss, a lot of, Kirby was from a really impoverished background. He almost lost his legs and his life in the war. Ditko had been sidelined for a year by tuberculosis. Stan had that, very intense family life and a kid brother and mother and father that he was really supporting. So I think a lot of it is that Depression era insecurity leavened with the Millie the model and the monsters and the horror. I mean, somehow they were all such professionals. They brought this stuff together, and of course, so you hear right, for every story that I've told you about how these things were created, well, there's at least half a dozen other, Kirby at times has claimed that he brought the idea for every superhero, including Spider-Man, and that Stan was just a glorified clerk who was his conduit to Martin Goodman. Ditko has claimed, there's, who and how, these people have become as mythical as the characters they created, but they, I think the personality you saw of Stan in public and the personality you saw in the comics, I think that was him. I think that was, the best of him and the curated him, but that was the guy. And I think all three of them, that came through. And there's something with Spider-Man especially about the high school experience. Most of these comic creators, I think that's another reason Stan was so enamored of college students and graduate students and professors being interested. None of these people ever made it past high school, not because they weren't smart enough, and not even because they couldn't have gotten scholarships. Stan, I think it was a girl he liked that he followed to CCNY for a semester, and then when they broke up, he dropped out of school, because that was his main interest in college. There was something about the intensity of the high school experience that for comics people, there were three high schools. There's DeWitt Clinton, there's Music and Art, and there's in Cleveland, Glenville High School, where Siegel and Schuster went. And I think these guys were just great at channeling the high school experience into these stories that became metaphors that people went nuts for.
I think...
Let's get some...
What's that?
I don't...
Oh, I just was going to say one more thing about that. We're kind of really concentrating on the loss and those feelings which I brought up. But I also think that the thing that Stan brought to it was the humor that, is in every cameo he is in. He always breaks the mood of the movie. If it's like super serious, you always have a moment where you're taken out of that. And his narration in those comics really brought a lot of humor, which that was also new.
Well, humor and look, and you make a good point, because if the stories weren't fun, if imagining being Spider-Man, maybe it wasn't fun to imagine being Peter Parker, but to imagine being Spider-Man, what could be more fun? To imagine being the Human Torch, or the Thing, or right? They all had that tragic aspect, but you're right. Ultimately, they were a lot of fun to spend time with, and Stan's narration was a lot of fun to spend time with. Yes, he loved humor. I think he definitely enjoyed the superheroes, but he liked putting humor in. And the thing that he enjoyed the most was taking movie stills from like old 50s movies, which they had lying around the office, and putting funny captions to them, or taking pictures of politicians and having them say funny things. Because he was still doing that in his 90s. He was, look, I guess they were relatively easy to do, but there were a lot of other things he could have done that were easy. And I mean, I can't imagine he made a whole lot of money doing them. He just loved doing funny shit that was just corny and silly. And right, it leavened the melodrama in a way that other people weren't doing. That's sort of where and how Marvel, it's that overnight success that took 20 years. It took 20 years of all those guys woodshedding and learning to do every possible genre and to meet a deadline, and many deadlines at once. And then suddenly, look, I got all these skills, let's combine them all together. And that's really where a lot of this came from.
Right.
So shall we?
Yeah, I think we should.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
You mentioned that Black Panther, the comic strip character, came about in 1967.
66, yeah.
66.
Yeah.
There was a radical organization by the same name around the same time. Was there an interplay? Did the comic strip character become the inspiration for the organization, or was that Stan Lee responding, politically to that organization, or was it just a coincidence?
He always claimed it was coincidence. I think I would imagine very soon after, because I think a couple of years later they tried to rename the character like the Black Jaguar or something.
Leopard.
The Black Leopard. Because they didn't want to be perceived as endorsing the organization. But I think the Black Panther political organization had a different origin modeled on, I think a Black Panther had been a symbol of black pride and power for a long time before that. So I think it was just coincidence as far as I can tell. Because Kirby had come up with what would become this character, but was originally called the Cold Tiger, which is not as quite a good name as the Black Panther. So I think it was just coincidence. Yes.
What was some of Stan's favorite things in the convention age, when the conventions were really big and popular? Like now.
What do you mean, what were his favorite things?
What was his favorite things about doing the conventions? Well, he was
well, Stan loved to perform in front of big crowds of people. He was a ham. He had a lot. There were two themes running through his life, and they involved some girl he was interested in and acting. And unless he was conflating them in his memory, there were at least two different occasions on which he joined acting companies, including the WPA Actors Division, because a woman he was interested in was doing it first. But he did love acting, starting out at the Hebrew Tabernacle of Washington Heights, which is where he joined their acting club at about age 12 because some girl he liked was in it. So I think he loved being loved. He got energized by fans. One of the stories in the book, and one of my favorite stories about Stan is we were doing one of these panels in Sacramento, and he was supposed to be there on a Saturday, and he didn't show up because he had what they said, and I think it was true. They said he had a bad reaction to a flu shot. So the convention sent a private plane. They fly him up there on Sunday, And I can see he's almost falling over, And the president of the convention gets up before the panel and he says, as you know, Stan was too ill to be here yesterday. He's a real trooper, though. He didn't want to disappoint you guys. So he's come to do the panel with Danny, but it's only going to be a 20-minute panel, not the 45 minutes that we usually do. Hope you understand. And then here's Stan and Danny. We come up, and every 5 minutes, somebody's flashing me a sign. 15 minutes to go, 10 minutes to go, 5 minutes to go. And it gets to be, time is up. And I say to Stan, as John explained to everybody, you're not feeling well. And we're just going to do a 20-minute panel. So is there anything you want to say to the people before we leave? And Stan looks at me and says, is God talking to you? Did he say we have to stop? I feel great. Let's keep going. Everybody is running around flashing me signs. I have no idea what they mean. But we kept going. And we did it.
Stan Lee is God.
Stan Lieber is God. Yes, exactly. That's another story. But so I think, look, there was this weird period the last couple of years of his life where who knows who was in control of what he was doing, but he still schlepped around to these conventions. And there were times he looked like a tired, sick, old man. But he would get up on stage, and he was Stan Lee with all that implied. So there was some part. So I think of anything at conventions, what he didn't like to do was to be on old timers panels. He hated that because he wanted to be considered a modern topical creator. And he was obviously not embarrassed or ashamed of what he did, but he was, till the end of his life, he had a company that was a intellectual property generating company. And he, that's why, once in a while you would see a video of him having done a nostalgia panel, but almost always it would be what his preference was, if not a solo one-on-one panel, would be to be with the directors and stars of whatever the movie was. You rarely saw him do an old-timers panel. Also, he outlived a lot of the old-timers, so that became less real. But he certainly preferred to be seen as somebody doing new stuff now. And you can see by the list, in the book I list some of the modern, the projects of the last 20 years, and I just listed a handful of them. He was, good, bad, or indifferent. He was always doing something, and usually 10 different things at once. Yes, back there.
I'm curious that since Stan Lee created these characters in the 60s and now have been around for almost 50 years, was there ever a point of a shelf life, let's end the characters now before gone on too long?
I have a two-part answer. It's very...
What was the question?
The question was, of all the Stan's characters Stan created, did any get canceled or not have continuous life? I just think it's very funny, and not a judgment on you or your question, but that Bob and I have been very careful to go, Stan co-created, Stan with this artist, with that artist, and of course your question was, Stan created all these, which is the very popular misconception, which got him into trouble for the past 50 years, because people got really mad at him when they thought he was taking sole credit. And yet it's so easy to happen. It's so hard to, in some ways
I think I did it once, actually, too.
and probably I did it too, but it's just, so thank you for giving me a chance to sort of point that out. But I think the Hulk got canceled after 6 issues, and then it took several years. For some reason, Stan had a belief in that character, and he kept guest starring him in Spider-Man and Fantastic Four.
And gave him to different artists.
And gave him to, right. Well, but Ditko actually ended up doing more.
I guess that's true.
A lot of him. So and Ant-Man, they had
And
a...
the billion, and Ant-Man kept getting canceled.
Right, Ant-Man kept getting changed from Ant-Man to Giant Man to Goliath. He had 20 different... a lot of the characters, not a lot, but some of them definitely did not have immediate success. I think the most surprising one is, and it's almost a necessity, that Iron Man became so big. Iron Man was never a top Marvel character in the 60s and 70s and 80s. He was like a middle-range character. I think just because they had made different arrangements with different production companies and studios to have the rights to Spider-Man and X-Men. They had to push Iron Man to the forefront, and they got very lucky that Robert Downey Jr. was the perfect person to play Iron Man. So yeah, there were a bunch of characters that came and went, and as we were saying, we all remember, and that was one of Stan's gifts too. We all remember the great, those of us who were reading them or have read them, the Galactus trilogy, all the Ditko Spider-Man and a lot of the Romita Spider-Man. We all remember those great stories. Marvel put out a lot of terrible stories in those years, really awful stuff. But Stan made you believe in them, and and he would even say sometimes, "This may not be the best story we ever did, but have some sympathy for us. We had to put out 10 other stories." I mean, he would literally say that, and it really was endearing, so even the stuff that wasn't so successful, he managed to put as good a spin on it as possible.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I remember when I was young, I used to watch these Marvel cartoons that
Right.
they were kind of like very crudely made,
Right.
but the stories were good. And then later on, there was also these more classic, I'll say, cartoons with Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. Was Stan involved in making these cartoons?
I think in those early ones he was. Anything early he was involved with. I think his attention and his interest would vary. But I think the ones you're talking about, the ones from the 60s, I think those he was very involved with. At a certain point, it got very frustrating for him because it became clear that a lot of the studios didn't care about his input. Their goal was different than his. If his goal was, of course, to sell comic books, but also to try to increase the sophistication and the appeal, I think a lot of the cartoon producers' goal was to sell toys and breakfast cereal, so they weren't interested in whatever Stan saw as the sophisticated Marvel approach. So his attention varied depending on the project.
So maybe John Semper's, because didn't John say that Stan had a good amount of input on stuff?
That Stan had what?
That Stan had a good amount of input on John Semper's?
Yeah, in the beginning, but then it was the guy John Semper, who was one of the main producer of the Spider-Man TV show in the 90s. But I think at a certain point he was glad that he found somebody he could trust in John and could delegate out to him and not have to be so hands-on involved. Yes?
If I don't ask this question, it will bug me as long as I own the book. I think I know the answer, but what's he doing with his hand?
He's doing the Spider-Man thwipping, which also became the Doctor Strange. And there are doctored versions of, if you can imagine with Photoshop what you could do with that, there are doctored versions of that on the internet, but I don't think that Stan ever intentionally flipped the bird at anybody in those photos. Yes, sir.
What inspired you to start a career in comic books?
Like Stan, I was a young person with no frigging clue what I wanted to do. But I knew I'd liked comics as a kid, and I lived in New York, and I was willing to invest the 25 cents for the subway token to go to, I knew enough, I knew somebody to get me in the door for an informational tour. So that, I loved comics as a medium. I was at that point in the 70s, I was interested in more an alternative and Harvey P. Carr and then the Jim Warren reprints of The Spirit. So I was always involved with some creative kind of thing and always loved comics. And like Stan, I thought maybe I'd have this job for a few months, and turned out it was a pretty good fit. So that was the beginning,
Were you ever involved in the fanzine world?
Not at all. I was not. It's ironic for someone who has made a living in the past several years of things related to conventions. I went to a comic convention in 1970 at the Suling Convention, and I said, "Well, that was fun. Now I never have to do that again." Little did I know, So no, I was a fan, but I never got involved with organized fandom.
I have a question.
Yes.
I heard some stories about how Marvel, years ago, like in the 70s, was kind of studied as an alternative corporate structure in a way. Did you ever hear anything?
Studied by whom?
People that want to maximize or have like a productive environment. Was that true? Like,
I have never, I mean, I don't know that it's not true.
Would that relate to like, I could
Like
see
business-
maybe animation studios or something, like having a collaborative, I don't know.
as opposed to DC structure? Is that correct?
Well, they had their origins were very different. DC had a very complicated corporate structure where all the editorial, like there were different editorial groups and they almost treated each other as rival companies. So like if, say if Bob was drawing for the Batman group or for Julie Schwartz's group, even though he's a freelancer and could do whatever he wanted, if he went over to Mort Weising's group, he'd be considered a traitor and would be like black. So, and later on, Marvel actually developed that structure when they got very big. Because for a while, like in the early 70s, Marvel would be what you study as a lesson in how not to organize a company. Because they took this structure of Stan and a couple of staffers and a bunch of freelancers putting out eight or 10 comics a month, and they didn't bother to change that structure when they were putting out 50 comics a month, which is why a lot of great experimental stuff happened in the 70s, Jim Starlin stuff and comics like that. Because really all the editors and the assistants had time to do was make sure nobody was having sex on panel, basically. And beyond that, it's like, get it out to the printer. So a lot of weird stuff came out. But no, I don't think Marvel was a place in that era that you would have given as an example to a business school class of how to manage a company.
I guess my second part of the question is, what remains of Marvel today as it was, say, in the 80s or 70s or 80s?
It's still in New York.
It's still in New York. Well, oddly enough, I think they went through a bankruptcy in the mid-90s. And I think, I left there as part of, I resigned to go work for a guy named Byron Price, and during a very unpleasant time in the company's history. And then they went into that bankruptcy, which I think brought them back to that little engine that could thing, where suddenly executives were turning off lights to not waste electricity, which is a good thing, but in the corporate world was not common. Counting paper clips. I mean, in my era, we'd gone, as things progressed, we'd have, $250,000 Christmas parties and stuff. I mean, it was not that kind of thinking. It was almost the opposite. Like the more you could waste, the better it looked. And so I think, in a way, Marvel went back to that. I think they've never fully recovered. And I think the structure, although they're owned by Disney, they still somehow seem to have the ability to make quicker decisions and respond to market conditions faster than DC has historically been able to do, which is ridiculous because they're both owned by gigantic corporations, but that DNA in their structure still seems to be at work.
Maybe the success of the Marvel movies gives the comic book people more freedom? Is that possible, or is that completely wrong?
I don't know. I mean, because I haven't worked on the comics directly. I will say, and I'm probably violating a contractual thing by saying this, that I just wrote a forward to a collection of comics I wrote in the 80s, and the contract I was sent for this was so long and so much fine print and so elaborate compared to like the half-page thing. So if that's a sign, no, it's not. So they certainly are as corporate as anybody. Does the success of the movies? I couldn't
I thought
tell
maybe
you.
they just wouldn't be paying attention to it. Like, oh, you do what you do. We're doing the movies, and you go ahead and.
There might be that kind of salutary neglect. I think that but they certainly do want to be sure that when somebody's doing something work for hire, that
Oh, absolutely.
every possible right that no one even imagined 20 years ago is retained. Yeah, in the back, yes.
Could you speak of Stan's relationship with Roy Thomas and Jim Shooter?
In 25 words or less? Can I just sort of ask your interest in...
Well, just historically more than anything else.
Stan always... Well, look, Roy was a very special case because Roy was the first editorial staffer to come in when Marvel started growing in the 60s. So I don't, and he, I think they were both very important in each other's lives. Stan hired Roy after a 15-minute interview. I think he just sensed there was some way that they'd be able to work together. And Roy had written a lot of letters. Stan was familiar with how Roy thought. Roy had been working for Mort Weisinger, D.C., and hated it. Weisinger was not a very good boss to Roy. And he came just to meet Stan. And he had taken the Marvel writing test, and he thought Stan was going to talk to him about being a writer. But Stan did not say anything about writing. He said, "What would it take to get you from National?" And Stan said, and Roy said, "Pay me $10 more a week." And he was literally working there that afternoon, because when he went to give notice to Mort fired him. And so Stan, Roy was back there. I think and then Stan would generally support his editors. There was he and Roy had some arguments about certain approaches to the business. That became problematic when Shooter became editor-in-chief, because since Stan's philosophy was to support whoever was the editor-in-chief, and it came to a conflict between Roy and Shooter, Stan sided with Shooter, which led Roy to go to D.C. But I think their relationship remained solid. They worked together a lot in ensuing years. But I think Shooter and Roy were very different people, and their regimes were appropriate for their times. Roy kind of led because the company expanded suddenly and didn't have enough support staff. Roy saw his job as one kind of thing and had less hands-on control of the comics. Shooter came in after that chaotic period when the books, there was the very high highs and very low lows, but the middle was kind of mushy. And Jim saw his job as getting things more towards a good middle, almost, with the occasional Frank Miller or John Byrne brilliance or whatever.
And that was years after Stan had mostly stopped writing. Is that right?
Had stopped writing or stopped?
Stopped writing for comics.
Yeah.
By the time Shooter came in, Stan wasn't doing any monthly comics.
No, but Stan was still in the office in New York.
Oh.
It was another 2 years before he moved to L.A. So, that's sort of some simplified answers to what's obviously very complicated question. But I think the bottom line is that Stan tried not to interfere in the day-to-day, minute decisions of comics. A, because he didn't want to undermine his editors. B, he had no interest in the day-to-day. He didn't really care who the Fantastic Four were fighting that month. He was more interested in developing Marvel in Hollywood and Stan Lee in Hollywood. Yes?
That kind of leads to my question. Why do you think comic books have become so influential in pop culture and film and TV, and what role did Stan Lee play in that, do you think?
Well, that's a simple question. Why have comics become so influential in pop culture, and what role did Stan Lee play?
Can I say one part?
Yeah, Bob,
I have one.
please.
Many years ago, I heard Scott Mccloud speaking about comics, and Scott Mccloud wrote a book called Understanding Comics, and he's kind of a popularizer of, maybe popularizer is the wrong term. He's a thinker about the way comics are effective and how they reach people in the world. And he suggested, this was 10 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, he said that comics were starting to get better press in the media. And he said it was because there's moles in the media. That is, people who grew up with comics in the 60s were old enough to start writing about comics in the 80s, and they were being taken seriously. And I think part of what has happened with comic books now is they've been around so long. There've been generations now of movie directors and actors who've grown up with these characters who treat them respectfully. And I think that it took Stan a couple of generations to get to the point where he could see the fans growing up in positions where he always wanted to be in Hollywood, being able to make these movies.
But I mean, look, part of that is who the hell knows? I mean, really.
That's the real answer.
No, I mean, because there's a million movies that come out. Why is this Marvel's moment in pop culture? I think because they are, bigger than life characters with some nuance to their personalities and their personal conflicts. I think because those movies are easily translatable to international markets. I think Stan, Jack, and Steve hit on a sweet spot of action and emotion and soap opera. But and of course a lot of the book is about that. But ultimately, the answer is who the hell knows? It's because these characters have been around forever, for 50, 60 years. What is it about the current moment in history, in the world? People are looking for heroes. People are in a complex world. People are looking for relatively simple answers. But it could just be that Spider-Man looks cool. I mean, it could be that. It could be, whoa, there's a guy shooting webs. There's a guy on fire. There's a big green. I mean, there's a lot of answers, but they could all be wrong next week. So I guess, I'm guessing you have a theory. Is there a reason you think that they're so popular?
No, I was curious.
Okay, I mean that's. People, that's what these companies do for a living is come out. What I find interesting, of course, is that, there's a million different kinds of comics. It's not just superhero comics. There's a million genres. There's a woman named Raina Telgemeier, who's the most popular graphic novelist in America. Many people have never heard of her. She sells more than Marvel, DC, anybody else.
A lot of people know who she is, though.
Okay, who here knows who Raina Telgemeier is? Okay, it's 4 people in a room of 50, so.
Maybe it's the demographic.
It could be, yes, if we were with 12-year-olds, they might know better. So there's many different kinds of comics, and there's still, Marvel and DC still put out, 50 comics each, 50 superhero comics each month. Many of them sell less than 10,000 copies, and yet the movie version of those characters, make billions of dollars. So is it the delivery system more than the character? I'm not trying to avoid your question too much, but Hollywood is filled with executives trying to answer that question right now, and publishing is filled with people.
So, and Stan was trying to answer that question for years.
And Stan spent frustrating decades trying to convince people that superheroes were worth taking seriously, and the people would.
I guess he did, right?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it is him, yeah. But I mean, it could certainly have easily ended up with Stan Lee as a celebrity and nobody caring about Spider-Man. That's an alternative outcome that wouldn't have been shocking. So you had a
interesting story. I remember back in 1978, there was a comic convention here in Huntington, tiny. Stan Lee was there, and John Romita was there, Marie Severin was there, and like half of Marvel was there. There were about 100 people there. Did that happen? Does things like that happen? Like, I don't understand it's gone, of course, but like.
Yeah, I think it could, because they were all local. I mean, not only Stan wasn't living in Long Island then, but he spent 20 years living on Long Island. There's one of my favorite things, I went to Stan's archives at the University of Wyoming. It was like 200 boxes of archival material and videos, and it was incredible stuff. But one thing I found was a flyer for Stan doing a signing at a dry cleaner in Hewlett Harbor. And I asked him about it, he didn't remember, but it must be, he lived in Hewlett Harbor, he was pals with the guy who owned the dry cleaner. Because it really said, come see Marvel Comics Stan Lee, at, Murray's dry cleaner. I mean, it was really...
Did that happen past 1980 or something?
If Stan was your pal, I think so, yeah. I mean,
It still does, like small comic book shops, stuff like that, it still happen. Where Midtown's technically bigger, but they'll have like a couple of artists and authors that'll come in, and they'll like do it. Meltdown used to do stuff like that too, but it's still like possible. It's just the venue itself has changed into where you have it as opposed to like a sort of hotel or convention center. Which is more
well, I think it depends if you're pals with an artist or writer. It's and that was always great about comics, right? If you wanted to meet even Stan Lee and you were persistent and you weren't, obviously crazy, you could meet Stan Lee, If you wanted to meet Steven Spielberg, the odds are not so good, I mean, if you wanted to meet Robert Downey Jr., probably not. But comics people, you can still meet. Somebody, do we have?
And I did have one more thing.
Let some other people have a chance, okay? Did somebody, I thought I saw another hand. Yes?
I have two quick questions. First of all, what was the name of the lady that you were saying that nobody knows the name of?
At which point?
Raina Telgemeier.
How do you spell that?
Raina Telgemeier.
RAINATELGEMEIER.
Oh.
Okay. And
I
second-
think her new book is called Guts.
Yeah.
She's brilliant.
Yeah, she's
She's brilliant. Sure.
And the other thing is, why did you go to Wyoming? What was the purpose? What was the? I understand that the research was there, but why was the research in Wyoming?
When you would ask Stan, why are your archives in Wyoming and not in LA or New York, he would say, well, Jack Benny's archives are there, and if it's good enough for Jack Benny. Now you may ask why Jack Benny's archives. The University of Wyoming has if you're ever in Wyoming, and actually I think it's worth a trip, they have what's called the American Heritage Center. And I think at a period when nobody on either coast in any universities was particularly interested in comics, they were. And so they aggressively went after comic book editors especially for their archives. And I mean, it's an amazing archive. I don't think it's redacted much or at all because Stan, there's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't make Stan look so good, and there's even, there was some personal data in the files that I had to go, I didn't have to, but because I believe with great power comes great responsibility, I went to the people running the archive and I said, maybe this document with Stan's entire family social security numbers on it shouldn't be available to anybody who comes to the... So, and so they also have this guy Mort Weisinger, they have Barbara Stanwyck, Jack Benny, they have a long list of Academy Award-winning writers and composers that aren't household names, but so for whatever, and it's like this man-made mountain in the middle of the campus, University of Wyoming. It's really, if you have run out of vacation spots, I have a feeling it's the kind of place, I'm guessing most people in this room, it's the kind of place where if you were in there researching and they said, there's been an epidemic and this place is quarantined and you can't leave for 6 months, you'd go, yeah, okay. That's fine, just send me a sandwich now and again and I'll just keep looking through the stuff. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Did you ever have any kind of creative difference or making comments about something that he was working on that he disagreed with and let you know?
I worked, oddly enough, I did more work with Stan after I left Marvel than when I was at Marvel. So I worked on a project called Rift World with him at Byron Price's company. And I remember having, the details are lost in the mist of time, but I think we had some disagreement about how some of the characters should be treated. That's the only, thing. I didn't work with him that much directly. My experience with him is mostly interviewing him for magazines or movies or stuff. So I didn't have, I know the stuff of his that I edited script-wise. He was, as I said, was great with. I remember we had some disagreement about something going on in this comic that was based on a series of novels that he had not written but had lent his name to. So I don't have any great, argument. No. It's
Telling him off, or
no
dirt.
I wish, but that'll be the next book. That'll be the secret. That'll be the dark internet, footnotes to the book. Let's see, what do you think? It's time to do it. So.
Well, I just thought, the one thought I just wanted to say is that I think one of the reasons, and they know that Stan saw this himself, is that people can connect to each other now with internet and everything. It's like, even when he was doing some of the original stuff with like Stanley's POV, putting out the videos, Jim was talking about how he did some of the voice stuff too on it, is that it allowed people to connect and showing pop culture is global and we can find each other as opposed to thinking we're all isolated with the other people who think this is cool.
So, I'm sorry, what was that? Is there a question in there?
Oh, no,
okay.
That was the thought.
Look, I think the internet, you're right, the internet probably has been very helpful in the characters. But again, there's a gazillion things competing for attention on the internet. I think Marvel, it took a long time for Marvel to figure out the internet, but I think now, I think their website is pretty robust and their web presence. Stan was I don't know if he was a techie, but he was an early adapter. And again, one of the great things about, if you were able to get his email address, he was the fastest email responder ever. Because he used to say he was a fast writer, not because he loved writing so much, just because he hated having anything looming over his head that he had to do. So again, I knew him to a certain degree, so I don't know if a stranger, but I never waited more than like an hour or two tops for a response to the dopiest email, whatever, he would just have a response, and very often a very witty, funny response. One, I just accidentally came across one the other day, when we were on the West Coast swing, just because I have a new phone and I keep pushing controls on it of things I don't mean to do. So this one turned up an archived email from Stan from near his last days, where he said something like, this has to be short, I can't see the keyboard and can't see the keys, hope everything goes well, Stan. I mean, it was kind of touching, but even then he wasn't saying to somebody, take a letter to Danny. He was like, can't see too tight, I'm not sure if that's an answer to anything, but.
Well, it does answer how he was able to script 12 comics a month for how many years? It's like, I gotta get this done.
I gotta get this done, and we need a new addition to the garage. I mean, those two. He was very fast and very quick-witted, but like me, a hunt and peck two-finger typist. Yeah. So
I think you should sign some books.
Maybe you should sign some books. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the great Bob Sikoryak. Thank you.
You're going to be signing fast.
I don't know. My name is not as short as that.
DF.